This is an introduction to chapter 16 of McCay, Toward a New Worldview. And the new worldview that he's talking about here are the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, which arguably are the most important things that happen in, well, maybe the entire course, maybe all of modern history. You'll decide for yourselves, but it is a tremendously important series of intellectual, academic, social developments that we're going to be covering in this chapter. Now notice the time period of this chapter is very long. It's from 1540 all the way up to 1789. So easily the longest period of any of the chapters we've covered in the course. And what we're dealing with here is essentially background events. During everything that we've talked about so far, the scientific revolution and or the Enlightenment has been happening in the background. So while the Renaissance was going on, scientific development. During the Arab exploration, scientific revolution. As we moved through the Reformation, science also marching forward. Absolutism, constitutionalism, the 17th century, more of this scientific revolution followed by the Enlightenment. And as we move forward, as we move into the 18th century, this is still going to go on. So what we're dealing with here is something which is happening very importantly, but is sort of in the background in the sense that it doesn't perhaps grab the headlines. It's not the first thing that people are thinking about or even aware of. While events are going on at the time. But in retrospect, we look back and we see this new worldview was developing, and this new worldview was incredibly important. Okay, so what are the big questions for this chapter? Well, okay, so we start with the basics. Why does the scientific revolution happen? When and where it does? What is this thing? Why is this thing? When? Where? Your basic definitional concepts. What is the scientific revolution? Why is it a big deal? That's basically going to be the first half of this chapter. Then we get to the second piece, which is what is the connection between the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment? This can be summarized perhaps most easily as the idea that the scientific revolution represents the creation of the modern mind, the modern way of thinking, and then the Enlightenment popularizes that new way of thinking. So think of the scientific revolution as the change and the Enlightenment as the spread or the application of the change. Finally, we need to think about to what extent does the Enlightenment really change government and society? You're going to be introduced to what are called the Enlightened Absolutists. And you're going to have to think about, were the Enlightened Absolutists actually a thing? Were they different in some important way from the absolutists or the rulers that came before them? Or are they just old-fashioned absolute monarchs with better press? So these are your big concepts. What's the scientific revolution? What's the Enlightenment? How do they interact? How do they change society? That's your big things. Okay, so what are the sections that McCay has in this chapter? His first section, rather lengthy, is called Major Breakthroughs of the Scientific Revolution. And here he's talking about what were the discoveries that were made in the 16th, 17th centuries. This is his straight-up chronological story of the scientific revolution. You may have gotten some of this in world history before. This is basically the story of how we go to a rational, evidence-based way of looking at the world. The stars here are people like Copernicus, the discovery of heliocentrism, the chain as we go from the theory to the confirmation, people like Kepler, Brahe, Galileo, and this handsome fellow, the rock star of all scientific rock stars, Isaac Newton. So this section is basically the chronological, almost great man theory version of the scientific revolution. What were these guys doing? What were they discovering? Then his second section, he calls important changes in scientific thinking. And it's a little bit of a grab-baggy section, but his basic question is, what were the intellectual and social changes that result as a consequence of the scientific revolution? And the stars here are the scientific method. How do we go from these discrete individual discoveries, the theory of Copernicus or the empirical evidence of Kepler, and how do we get into a broader scientific theory, what you all are familiar with that from your junior high school science courses as the scientific method. McCay also throws in a few other things he wants to talk about here, like, for example, the changes in medicine and some societal impacts of things like that. So it's sort of Scientific Revolution 1, introduction, Scientific Revolution 2, development and consequence. Those are your first two sections of this chapter. There's a nice a section here on an individual character, Madame du Châtelet, who was a French woman, fascinating. She was a great friend of Voltaire. She translates the works of Newton into French, which is no small feat, and she sort of represents a bridge between the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. And so then it's the Enlightenment, the third section of the chapter, that we turn to next. And McCay's basic question is, well, what new ideas emerged? What institutions allowed them to take hold? And again, this is sort of the idea that the Enlightenment was a social movement which took the ideas, the rationality, the new orientation of the scientific revolution, and then applies it to society, applies it to government, applies it to economics, and applies it in a popular way, which is really going to affect the changes in society. So that's the basic argument of McCay. That's what he's teeing up for you here. One of the stars of this, and a character you need to pay attention to, is this fellow Denis Diderot. Diderot is one of the Enlightenment's leading figures. He is the editor, the creator of the Encyclopedia. And the Encyclopedia is a fascinating story, and you'll be introduced to it briefly in this section of McCay. But essentially, it's sort of like Wikipedia for the 18th century. The idea that Diderot and others had was that we could collect knowledge. We could put it all in one place. We could edit it, curate it, and then we would find a way to sort of expand human understanding. It's a very optimistic view of humanity and of education and of the value of scholarship, and therefore it is, of course, very Enlightenment. So pay attention to Diderot, pay attention to his idealism and his attempts to spread learning. Finally, the last section of the chapter is a political section. It's on Enlightened Absolutism. And the question that McCay is teeing up here is, what impact did the Enlightenment have on political developments and monarchy? So basically, this is the question: does all of this that we've been talking about, all this scientific revolution, Enlightenment, rationality, new ways of thought, all that, does it matter? Does it actually change politics? Do people rule any differently as a consequence of all this stuff? Or is it all just sort of verbiage and a gloss, and when all is said and done, what really matters is guns and power and coercion? It's not an obvious answer to this question. So part of this is straight up political history, the political history as we move into the 18th century, and you need to keep your eye on that. But you also need to think about how is it representative of these broader forces that are happening in the period. Okay, so really cool, really important chapter. Hope you enjoy it. See you in class.